Does Trump have ties to Russia? Well, in the book Unredacted, Russia, Trump, and the Fight for Democracy by Christopher Steele, he does, and here's why you should be concerned about that. So Christopher Steele is a former British intelligence officer who worked in Russia during the fall of the Soviet Union, allegedly for MI6. Afterwards, he entered into the private sector, providing consultancy for people who are trying to do business, specifically in Russia. There was even one time when he met with Ivanka Trump and Don Jr., and essentially they talked about how to find contacts in Russia in order to open up business contracts. That didn't lead to anywhere. However, in 2016, he became most notable for eventually coming up with what is known as the Steele dossier. The Steele dossier is essentially a report of raw intelligence, in that they are intelligence reports that are not 100% verified, but what Steele himself considers to be about 70% accurate. And at the time, what they discovered was that Trump had multiple ties to Russia, and that Russia had what is called a compromat, which is compromising materials against Donald Trump. Things such as footage of him at illicit or depraved parties, actions of him with prostitutes. There's also instances of bribery and other claims as well. These claims were so concerning that Steele reported it to British and American intelligence in the FBI because he was concerned that Trump had a conflict of interest and was himself a Russian asset. The report was eventually published without Steele's knowledge or consent in January of 2017 by BuzzFeed, and that became known as the Steele dossier. Now, in this book, it is essentially a personal defense by Steele as to some of the claims that have been laid against him, which I found personally interesting, and here's why. The first thing is that Steele didn't agree with the publishing of the report. However, a lot of the claims from the report have been verified by the Mueller investigation and other findings that have come to light lately over the past few years. The second thing that's really concerning is how Trump weaponized the FBI to attack his own critics. So essentially, he would find out that there were reports like the Steele dossier. So he would use the FBI to investigate people that he didn't like. And if they found sources that were reporting his ties to Russia, then he would publicly out those sources so that they would be compromised. The book indicates, but it doesn't say anything because it most likely does not want to incriminate people, that there are multiple sources who may have died because Trump had their identities leaked to the public. Trump also ties up his opponents with legal fees by essentially charging them with whatever crime he can and then delaying and prolonging the cases for as long as possible until his opponents can no longer afford the legal fees. Steele himself was under trial by Trump for a long time, and even though he was exonerated and proven right in court, Trump never paid the judgment. Essentially, because Trump is a Russian asset, he is incapable of serving the American people because it's a conflict of interest to him. And for that matter, you can see that in his public discourse, in that it is very difficult or even impossible for him to publicly denounce the actions of Russia. You can also see this in how Trump and J.D. Vance's stance towards ending the war in Ukraine is essentially appeasement. The Biden administration is not willing to do appeasement because they understand that appeasement was attempted in the 1930s with Hitler and it didn't work. And the same thing wouldn't work with Russia either. This has been Russia's strategy for over a decade now. Essentially, they prop up far right-wing political candidates in order to destabilize regions such as the EU or the United States. I don't think that people understand the reach and influence of Russian propaganda in the United States, also in other countries too. Like, the Brexit vote was heavily pushed for by Russian media as well. They were trying to destabilize the EU, and they were successful. In the United States, there have been multiple cases of escalating racial tensions and violence that are being stoked by Russian troll farms. For example, I had a girlfriend who attended a counter-protest at an Islamic religious center in 2016 in Houston. That protest was organized by Russian trolls in Vladivostok. I used to read articles as a kid all the time saying that the F-35 program was overly expensive and an ultimate failure. However, I later realized and learned that that was Russian propaganda. There are content creators like Tim Pool where the reports recently came out that they were basically bought and paid for by the Russian government. You have people like Tucker Carlson, who are essentially Russian assets at this point. Jill Stein, I also consider to be a Russian asset. You have conspiracy theories coming out, people claiming that immigrants are treated better than citizens in this country. You have claims that we are wasting money on Ukraine. That's all Russian propaganda. While Russian propaganda is pervasive, there's one more thing that is a little bit more concerning, in that while Putin is not above assassinating his opponents, either by throwing them out of windows, poisoning them, or shooting down their planes, it is now indicating that we are moving towards a new step in which Putin will attempt to assassinate people who are not considered Russian nationals. So, in page 313 it states, separately, in mid-2024 we received intelligence suggesting that relations between Russia and the West had deteriorated to the point where the Kremlin had ordered a new program for kinetic operations, i.e. assassinations and sabotage against leading NATO member states. An FSB scientific research institute near Moscow had been revamped for training and planning purposes in this regard. The direction of travel is clear. We in the US and UK have entered a pre-war phase with Vladimir Putin's Russia. It is a frightening prospect for sure, but needs to be recognized and addressed by our politicians and military leaders without further delay. I think that's a very valid concern. I would also be concerned about the future of the United States, in that it is an internal threat that is the most likely one to destabilize our country. I think that people really underestimate how much Russian propaganda that there is in American discourse, and we need to identify that and squash that before it becomes even worse than it already is.